Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Ketubot Nimvav. Not a simple one, but we will get through it. Today's stuff is sponsored by Lisa Lo Denker in honor of the engagement of Alyssa Gold and Alexander Denker. May the joy and love you have today always fill your life. Okay, we ended in the middle of a question, which will be different from today. Today, we're going to actually end at the end of a section. But yesterday, we ended in the middle. So we have to review a little bit to get back to where we were up to. If you remember in the Mishna, there was a machloket, Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria and the rabbis about a ketuba of an arusa, a woman who's betrothed. If she gets divorced or widowed from betrothal, does she get all the money in the ketuba, or does she only get the 200 or the 100 zuz, the basic, and not the tosefet, the additional? I just want to point out that the Mishna starts off also with, can you add, right? It says you can add money to your ketuba. Then it had this machloket, Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria and the rabbis about whether it's she gets the tosefet even if she's only betrothed, or is it only if she's married? Then we have this machloket about, can they detract from her ketuba, right? If you notice, it starts with additions to the ketuba and ends with subtracting from the ketuba. What if he has her admit that she received part of it, even though she didn't really? And she's basically saying, I'll give up on part of it. That's going to be the second part of today's stuff. So it's kind of additions and then subtractions from the ketuba. And there we also had a machloket, just to review. So when we get there, you'll remember Rabbi Yehuda says she can write, I received part of my ketuba already, and that is valid. And Rabbi Meir says anyone who does this, if he gives her any less than what she deserves, it's called a be'ilat znut. It's like having licentious relations with this woman. It's as if you're not married. So we're going to talk about all that later. So now the question is, we had a machloket Rav and Rabbi Natan. One of them held like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, that the woman doesn't get the tosefet from betrothal. And someone said, no, we don't hold like him. We didn't know who said what. Immediately the Gemara says, well, it's obvious to us that Rabbi Natan was the one who held like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, because Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria must go by umdana, which means we make an assessment of what the person was thinking. And we can assume that why was the man promising the woman extra money? Because he wanted to be married to her to enable him to have sexual relations with her. And that must be his motivation. That never happened in this case, and therefore she doesn't get the tosefet because he didn't ever intend it to be until they were married. That's his assumption. And then we make a second assumption, which is there's people who hold by umdana and there's people who don't hold by umdana. So it must be the people who hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria hold by umdanas, that we can make these assessments. And people who don't hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria must hold people that you can't make these assessments about what people are thinking, which we said was a little bit strange because the rabbis are always making assessments. We never really split it into there's those who do and those who don't, right? We often split it between, well, if there's a machloket, it's more, what do we think this person was thinking? In the end, that's what the Gemara is going to say, which is, no, because what happened was in the Gemara, I won't give away the end yet, but the Gemara then said, wait a minute, you're assuming Rabbi Natan holds by umdana, and they proved it from a source where he holds about a masukan, a guy who's about to go away and leaves a get for his wife, and didn't say give it to her, just wrote write it to her. We assume he meant give it to her because we can assess what he was thinking. That's Rabbi Natan. But then the Gemara says, but what? You think Rav doesn't hold by umdana? But what about the person who was lying on his deathbed? And even though you don't really need to do a kinyan, an act of picking up a handkerchief, he did it anyway. What was he trying to say by doing that? We assess his mindset, and we assume that he wanted it to be somewhat like a gift of a healthy person. He wanted to make sure that even if he got better, this gift would go through, and that's why he did it. And therefore, again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing there, what the other side is, in what aspect did he want it to be a matnat shchiv meira, a person on their deathbed, and what Shmuel said. But the point being that their Rav also goes by umdana. So that's where we were left. So to which the Gemara answers right at the top of our daf, Ele travayu azli batar umdana. They both hold by umdana. It's just a matter of what's the assessment we make about what he was thinking, which is the obvious answer, right? We can make assessments. It's just different people assess different things. Manda amar halacha, the one who holds like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria Shapir. That's easy. You don't need to explain it. Obviously, he holds. We assess that why the husband give her the tosefet, because he wanted to be married to her in order to have relations with her. That didn't happen, so she doesn't get it. Manda amar ein halacha, hachanami umdan datahu. He's also assessing what the person's opinion was. Why does he say she gets the tosefet from engagement? Mishum iklu vedatahu va'ikar v'ledata. Why did he give her the tosefet? Not because he wanted to have engaged in relations with her. No, he wanted to be close to someone, right? He wanted that close relationship, right? You all know when you're engaged, you already have this very close relationship with your fiance. So that's what he was looking for. And that's for that he promised her, right? You can understand this in all different ways, right? There's people who are concerned they're not going to get married. So they have this peace of mind once they're already engaged. They know, oh, I found my bashir, right? Or there's the relationship that makes you happy. So whatever it is, the engagement already took care of that for us. So for him, which means the tosefet that he was promising her was because of what he already gained from the betrothal, which means that since that's the case, she's going to get her ketuba from the betrothal because the tosefet was based on what existed already before he divorced or died. Okay, so you would think the sugya would end here, but the sugya takes an interesting path, and you'll see why in a minute, and we'll discuss why it's particularly interesting and I would say a little bit perplexing. Yativ Rav Chanina, some people have, there's an aleph there, it should add kara. He was a Tanakh guy, okay, from Mikra. So Rav Chanina Kara sat kamei de Rabbi Yanai in front of Rabbi Yanai v'ka'amar halacha ke Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Okay, just like Rav and Rabbi Natan had this machloket, also we're going to see a bunch of others who had this debate. So he's sitting in front of Rabbi Yanai and he says, I hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. We hold that way. That's the halacha. Amar le. Rabbi Yanai gets very angry at him and says, Puk kra chalebra. Go teach these psuki. Go teach Tanakh outside the Beit Midrash. He's actually insulting him, I think, in two ways. Number one, stick with Tanakh. Okay, you're better at that. Number two, go teach outside. You don't have a place in this Beit Midrash. Okay, whenever people say that, every time we get to a statement like this, usually it's Puk tana livla. Go take that braita outside of my Beit Midrash. It shows a lot of passion and a lot of, right, that this is something he's super upset about. Ein halacha ke Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. We do not hold like him. Now, I say this interestingly because if you think about machlokot, that we get people passionate about them, I wouldn't think that this was the one, right? Because this machloket, in the end, how much relevance does it have? How often is there a woman who's betrothed and then widowed or divorced from the betrothal? And you would have to have also that he added money to the ketuba. So we're talking about, right, usually you get passionate about things that are very common and you disagree about them. Whether or not she gets her tosefet, and on top of that, it's not like there's a right or wrong here. It's either money coming out of the husband or money not going to the woman, right? There's two sides as a man and a woman. Why is he so passionate about this? Whether she should get the ketuba money or she shouldn't, right? He's pretty passionate, if you notice, that the woman get her full money because he goes against Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Maybe he was, fighting for women's rights. I don't know, but it's just interesting. And it's not only this line, but we're going to see it. And this is why you're saying Medina, not necessarily. You're saying maybe it's someone close to him because you're going to see it wasn't just him, but the Gemara keeps going. There was Rav and Rabbi Natan who disagreed. There's now Rav Chanina and Rabbi Yanai. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Mishum Rabbeinu halacha ke Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. And Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel halacha ke Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. We're now quoting two more people. Notice who they are. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Mishum Rabbeinu. I actually didn't look up who Rabbeinu is. Sometimes it's Rabbi Yehuda and a C. I don't know if that's what it means here. Rav Nachman passes in the name of Shmuel. Here I want you to pay attention specifically to the names, because you'll see in a second. But Rav Nachman did, so they both held like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. But Rav Nachman did, but Rav Nachman, even though he passed on the Torah of Shmuel, saying we paskin like him, he himself said, Ein halacha to Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. But it gets even more complicated, because Nehardea, which was the city where Rav Nachman was from, Mishmei de Rav Nachman Amrei halacha Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. There's a whole disagreement about what Rav Nachman himself said. First, the Gemara says he himself said, we don't hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Then in the Nehardea, they said in his name that he does hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Thank you, Caroline, for pointing out. The Koran says it is Rabbi Yehuda and a C. So I guess that was good. And now we're going to get even more here. Afagav dilat Rav Nachman v'amal. Even though Rav Nachman cursed, lat is to curse, v'amal, and he said, Kol dayana dedayin ki Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria hachi v'hachi tehave. Any judge who rules like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, this and this will happen to him. Okay, so if you thought it was unique to one situation, no. He's really passionate against it. But notice the sentence started off with afal gav, even though Rav Nachman cursed anyone who held like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, Afilu hachi, even so, halacha ki Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. The Gemara tells us, we know we cursed out all the judges who do this, but we actually do hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. She doesn't get her tosefet. The halacha lemaaseh, and this is very strange. We talk about halacha lemaaseh all the time. It's a very common term. Very rare do you see this term in the Gemara, halacha lemaaseh. I don't remember coming across it. Halacha lemaaseh, usually they say hilchata, kit Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. And the sugya paskins at the end, we hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Okay? I think it's Rashi who says, halacha lemaaseh. Oh, by the way, Mishum Rabbeinu, I see that Rashi says Rav, although there's a footnote there. Rashi says it's Rav. I don't know. There's a footnote. I'm not sure where it goes to. Okay. So the Rabbeinu is Rav. Anyway, halacha l'maaseh, Rashi says, Hashas kapasik, shekach nimnu v'gamru b'nei yeshiva. I don't know where Rashi gets this from, but he says the b'nei yeshiva got together and basically did a vote, and they voted that we're going to hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Right? Sometimes I told you the other day that sometimes this halacha is an added addition from later. Not so clear exactly what this is. Why? I don't have a good answer to why this became such a passionate issue and why the Gemara had to tell us so much about the back and forths and who said what and what said, and why this became such a critical issue when, again, how relevant it was is really a good question. Okay. Before we finish with this topic of Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria and the whole first half of the Mishnah, we have two questions. And since we hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, these two questions seem to be about his opinion. So he thinks that she's not going to get the tosefet if they're not married, which sounds like as soon as they get married, right? If she gets widowed or divorced, she would get her ketuba. So, but remember, his whole thing was, we assume that what's he looking for? The relations with the wife. So comes Ravin and asks the obvious question. We had this before with some other cases earlier in the Masechet, right? Some other situations. What if she goes into the chuppah? She has chuppah, they're married, but they don't end up having relations, and then he divorces her or he drops dead. Do we say chibat chuppah kona? Do we say it's the chuppah itself that's kone, and that was enough? Because now why? Again, it all in the end, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, the way they understand him anyway, it all has to do with the sexual relations. It's just that the chuppah already preferred. So Becky, you're asking the question that is Rav Ashi's question. So wait with that. Is that the chuppah is an enabler. It enables them to have relations. So is that enough? Because he already knows that's coming next. Or is it really only once they actually engage in relations? So Tashma, let's try to learn it from here. Detane Rabbi Yosi. He brought a braita that said, he says, the only reason he wrote of the Tosefet was because of the love or the closeness of the first night. So this fits very well with chuppah, because the chuppah happens on the first night, and we'll see in a minute why it's more likely it's chuppah than having relations. But if you want to go the other way, if it's all about the bi'ah, that can happen on all subsequent nights. It's only the chuppah that happens on the first night. For relations can happen all throughout the marriage. So it doesn't make sense, the language of the first night. To which, so their proof is, and I want you to keep, it's going to be a little back and forth. So keep straight with where we're at. They're trying to prove from this source, Laila Rishon must be relating to the chuppah because that happens on the first night, first day, which is what the Gemara is going to ask now. Wait a minute. Elamai chuppah. If they're saying chuppah b'layla ita b'yamam aleita, but the chuppah could be during the day, it could be at night. So you wouldn't say Laila Rishon if you're referring to chuppah. It sounds more likely they're talking about relations, which happens at night. So then they say, wait, v'litamech is a counter to that, right? They countered the proof, and now they're countering the counter against the proof. Litamech b'ya b'layla ita b'yamam aleita. What? You can only have relations at night? You're assuming Laila Rishon means night. You can't have relations during the day? You can. Ha'amarava imaya b'bayit afel mutav. Rava says you can't have relations during the day as long as you make the room dark. So if you can make the room dark, you can have relations during the day, which means you can also have relations during the day. So Laila Rishon really isn't such an indicator either which way. So to which they say, Halo kasha orach ara kamash malan de biya b'layla. No. Don't question that. It's, again, the fact that it says, so where are we now? We tried to say it says Laila Rishon. Laila Rishon seems to relate to chuppah that happens only on the first night, whereas relations happen all throughout. But then they say, no, Laila doesn't really match chuppah because chuppah could happen during the day. To which they say, well, it doesn't necessarily match relations because that could also happen during the day. To which they say, no, what they're saying is generally, right? What's generally most people end up having relations at night, not during the day. And therefore, it actually makes more sense to say it's relations rather than chuppah. Ela chuppah kashya. Chuppah really doesn't make so much sense, to which the Gemara answers, chuppah nami lo kashya, and there's a debate now what this means then. If we say chuppah is not difficult, or we're going to explain it with chuppah, which in a minute you'll see why, does that mean that we basically undone the disproofs of the proof and we're left with the proof and it is chuppah? Or is it unresolved because it really could be either way and the braita is unclear? And then we don't really have an answer to the question. So there's two ways the commentaries understand this. Either one could be read into the sugya. But why is it not difficult? Kevan destam chuppah lebia kaima. Most people have a chuppah so that to enable them to have relations. Orach ara kamash malan de balayla. So therefore, since it's integrally connected with the relations they're going to have at night, therefore they just said at night, but it really could still be referring to chuppah. So that was question number one, which maybe we have an answer to, maybe we don't, not so clear. By Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi now answers, well, if you're going to say, like we just said a minute ago, but that's enough, let's say, okay? Let's say you go with the conclusion, even just that side, the chuppah is enough, and therefore she gets her tosefet, but what if, and this is what I saw you ask Becky in the chat, by Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi says, what if she goes into the chuppah and she's in nidda, which means that the chuppah does not enable them to have relations. So now there's a debate here, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but Rashi says, pirsa after she went to the chuppah, which isn't so clear to read through the rest of the sugya. The Rash says before, meaning she had already been in nidda before she got to the chuppah. Im timtzalomer chibat chuppah kona, chuppah dechazi lebiyah. If you say the chuppah is enough, it would have to be a chuppah that's ru'uyah lebiyah, that could potentially enable them to have relations. But a chuppah that doesn't enable relations wouldn't be then. Odil Maloshnar, do we say it doesn't really make a difference? And I would assume the logic, it doesn't really make a difference because it's a chuppah that enables bi'ah, in a few days. It's not like it is still enabling bi'ah. You might have to wait a few days, but still that was enough for him to be, committed to this tosefet, this addition, to which the Gemara answers, Teku, we don't have an answer. Okay, so that's the first part of today's daf, which was a diyun in the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria and the machlokes he had with the rabbis. Who do we hold like? In the end, we say Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Then we had two questions on that. What if chuppah v'lo nevala? And what if chuppah and she was in nidda? Now we're moving on to the second part of the Mishna, which is Rabbi Yehuda, and this is the part that's a little more complicated. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir have this debate, and at the end of today's daf, we'll see there's a third opinion of Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yehuda says, and I want to read it inside so you see the language, because we're going to darshan a lot of the language here today. We're going to infer things. Im ratza kotev lebetula shtar shel 200. If he wanted, he could write a document for 200. V'hi kotevet, and she writes, it kabalti mim chamanim. I already received half of it. Okay, and I'm not going to read the rest. It's the same thing with the widow. Okay, I'll leave Rabbi Yehuda for right now. I'll leave Rabbi Meir aside. We'll read Rabbi Meir before we get there. So first question is, now what we assume happens is he writes her ketuba for 200, and then she writes a different document that says on it, I received 100. Now, normally, if we have a loan out, I loaned you money, and I get to keep the document that says you owe me money, so I pull it out when I want you to pay back. And let's say you paid half. Okay, in this case, it's going to mimic this case. Now, in this case, she didn't really pay half. And in the end, we're going to distinguish because of that. But the assumption is she writes this shovar, it's called a shovar, it's like a receipt that says, I received 100. And then he holds that in his hand, and she has the ketuba. When she pulls out her ketuba to demand it, he's going to say, oh, but I already paid you 100. Same thing with a loan. A loan, who keeps the document? Me. So I keep the document, I loaned you money. When you pay me back half, we write a shovar, and this is going to be the question, is this the way you do it or not? We write a shovar, right? This will be the parallel. We write a receipt that says, I paid, right, that you paid me 100. You, right, let's say it was a $200 loan. You write, I paid you 100. And then you keep that. So when I pull out my document, basically, you're going to say, right, you're going to pull out yours and say, but I already paid you half. Okay, so same thing here, remember. Okay, so you're asking in the chat, so I'm going to make it very clear. She's the one who wants to get the money. She's like the lender, the malveh. So she keeps the document of the ketuba that says you owe me money. And he keeps the one that says, I already paid her, because he wants to protect himself and say, look, I already paid her. I don't owe her all the money. Now, again, this case is a little different because he didn't really pay her, but it's as if he did because she agreed to basically give up half her rights of the ketuba. So now they say, Rabbi Yehuda savar kotvim shavar, but wait, in a case of a loan, Rabbi Yehuda does not allow the writing of a shavar, and we'll see why. Perhaps not. And then how could he basically say we do the same thing here? Someone who paid part of his loan. Rabbi Yehuda omer yachlif. We rip up the first star and we rewrite a star for 100. The first one said I loaned you 200. You paid me 100. We rip up the first one and we write a new one that you owe me 100. Why? Because what's the concern? Maybe you'll remember you're keeping the shavar in your hand. Maybe you'll lose it. Maybe mice will eat away at it. Right? There were mice in those days that ate through documents. We saw this in different situations. With the whole thing of the truma and the Sifrei Torah can be tmeim, right? By touching them, that was all just to prevent. They don't really, but it was just to prevent the mice from eating them. People would keep the truma because it was sanctified with the Sefer Torah, and they didn't want the mice to eat the Sifrei Torah. Apparently, mice ate parchment, and therefore they said we're worried that he might lose it. And then the malva will take out the star of 200. You owe me 200, and the lova will have to pay back the whole thing. So comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, you rip up the star and you write a new one. Rabbi Yosi omer yichtov lo shavar. Rabbi Yosi has no problem with the shavar, but Rabbi Yosi isn't of interest to us. We want to deal with Rabbi Yehuda's contradiction. So how does he allow a shavar in our case? I'm a Rabbi Yirmia. We're going to have two answers. Kisha shavar tami tocha. When it said she writes, I received 100, she writes it in the document. Either we attach the receipt to the original document, or we write it in on the document itself, okay? So probably meant we write it in on the document itself. And then, right, then anytime she pulls out the ketuba, it says it in the ketuba, right? Attaching it wouldn't be a good idea because then she could just pull it off. So I assume it means you write it in the document itself. That's one answer. Abaye amar afilu tema b'she'ein shovar tami tocha. Even if you say not, I have another answer. These two cases are very different. In the case of the borrower, I lent you money. You definitely pay me back 100. Dilma merkas tavarta. What are we worried about? Maybe you'll lose your shoval. Right, and I'll pull out the star and I'll collect the whole thing a second time. But here, did he for sure give her the money? No, it's more likely the case that she didn't get any money. She's just, saying, I'll give up on my money. Well, why does that make things different? Milta ba'al mehida amrei, right? She just said it, meaning she just wrote it in. It wasn't true. And therefore, what? Natre. It's his problem to keep it. Now, if he keeps the shavar, okay, he kept the shavar and he'll pay her less than she's really deserving of. Ilo natre. What if he loses it? It's not like if you pay me back 100 and you really only owe me 100 more, well, that's a big loss for you. But for this husband, first of all, he owed her 200 to begin with. He got her somehow, or she decided out of her own goodwill, we don't know why, to give up on it. But really, she was deserving of it. So what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is he loses it. Remember, he's supposed to keep the shavar. So if he doesn't keep it, it's him causing a loss for himself. Not the same thing. She's demanding what she actually is deserving of. And if he, he made this agreement with her and she gave up on half of it and he loses it, the proof of it, who cares, right? It's his loss. He started this whole thing in the first place. So basically, it's not the same thing at all. Now we want to know, so that's Abaye's answer. Now we want to know why each one didn't say like the other. Bishlama Abaye lo amar Rabbi Yirmia. That's more easy to explain why Abaye didn't hold like Rabbi Yirmia, lo katane shavarta b'tocha, because it didn't say in the Mishna that she writes it in the ketuba. If that was the case, they should have said it very specifically in the Mishna. Ela Rabbi Yirmia, my time lo amar Abaye. Why didn't he say like Abaye? Gzeira shavar dahacha atu shavar da'alma. Maybe you could say that Rabbi Yirmia doesn't think that they should write a shavar in this case, because if we allow a shavar in this case with the ketuba, people might come to mistake it and think that you can use a shavar also in a loan. So because you can't use it in a loan, we're going to be stricter about using it in a ketuba, even though really theoretically they're totally different cases. So therefore, Rabbi Yirmia didn't suggest that suggestion and only said he should write it in the document. Okay, so now, okay, I'll stop for 1 second because I see your question, which is why Caroline's asking, why is it permitted for her to give up her ketuba money? That's exactly the question here, the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Can she give up? Can't she give up? And we're going to talk about this more as we go forward. And we're going to even see that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow it in all cases. So now that's the next question. So the first question of Rabbi Yehuda was that, doesn't he contradict Rabbi Yehuda somewhere else about this writing of a shavar? In the end, they say, right, 2 possible answers. Now we're going to move on to the second question. The second question is going to come from an inference from what Rabbi Yehuda says. Tama de katvale. This only works if she writes him a document that says, I received 100. Aval al peh lo. But if she just stipulates it orally, it doesn't work. Why we distinguish between oral and written is a lot, it's very unclear here. If you're confused by this, so are the Rishonim, and it's not so clear exactly why there's this distinction Baal Peh and written, but the main thing is going to be what they say about this Baal Peh. Baal Peh, it's basically a condition. Why written it's not a condition is a good question. It also seems to be a condition, but we're going to leave that question aside because it's hard to find a good, I struggled to find a good answer to that question, but I did see that the Rishonim struggled with it and all proposed some answers. In any case, we're going to infer right now that she can't make an oral stipulation. He gave me half the money and basically say, right, what we normally call, right, mochelet al ketubata. She's basically saying, I don't really care. She can't do that. So even Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says he has to give her the whole amount. Rabbi Yehuda says he also has to give her the whole amount if she's going, right, if she says, oh, I already received half the money orally, that won't help. Only if it's written. So why am I? So now the question is, why does Rabbi Yehuda agree with Rabbi Meir specifically if she says it orally? Okay, now we're assuming, this again, the Rishonim fill in the details here. This is a very fascinating sugya. That the reason why she can't do a Baal Peh is because this is what we call matneh al masha katuv b'Torah. Matneh al masha katuv b'Torah means you can't make a stipulation against what the Torah says. The Torah says she has to get a ketuba of 200 zuz. Doesn't really say so in the Torah, and hold off on that. There's actually a big machloket, which today we're going to see is also machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, about whether ketuba is deoraita or derabbanan. Okay, it talks about moar habatulot. Remember we saw that with the mefateh. He has to give her kimor habatulot. So some people say, right, that's the ketuba, and some people say that's a proof that ketuba is deoraita, even though it never says you have to give a ketuba, right? Some people don't view that as a deoraita halacha. It maybe was just talking about something that existed at the time, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was a Torah law, and it's only rabbinic. So we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, let's just assume right now it's Torah or it's just halacha, whether we call it Torah or not Torah. You can't make a stipulation against what the Torah says, okay, or what law says. The law says she has to get a ketuba, so how could you possibly, right? So now he's basically saying you can't make a stipulation against what it says in the Torah, okay, because that he says, if you say it Baal Peh orally, you can't do that. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because you're matneh mash katuv b'Torah. But why? Amai. Davar shebimamonu. It's money. It's not like I want to say I want to eat non-kosher food, right? I promise I'm going to eat non-kosher food or something, right? Or some sort of t'nai that would go against Torah law. In the world of Isser v'Heter, this is in the world of mamonot, of money. And so what does that make a difference? Well, Sham'ina leila Rabbi Yehuda. We learned that Rabbi Yehuda himself says, Damal, davar shebemamon t'na'o kayam. When it comes to monetary law, the Torah says this is the monetary law, and you want to go against it, okay, like in our case, ketuba, you have to give 200 zuz. And he says, right, or she says, you don't have to, and he says, I'm not going to. That is permitted if they make a financial agreement between them and she doesn't care. So that's fine. You're allowed to do that. That's Rabbi Yehuda's position. Even though, again, it's tricky because Rabbi Yehuda also said it doesn't work, but he does say it doesn't work. I'm sorry. He says it does work, but he only says it works if it's written, not if it's oral. Why not if it's oral? Because you're basically making a stipulation against what it says in the Torah. And that disagrees, that goes against what Rabbi Yehuda says elsewhere. Where does Rabbi Yehuda say that you can go against what it says in the Torah if it's financial? Titanya, as it says in the following, braita, somebody says, I'm betrothing you, but I'm not under the condition that I'm not going to provide for you the three basic things that every married man has to provide for his wife, right? The shiur, ketuba, and onah, which we have different interpretations, but basically, right, the food, the clothing, the food, and the onah, which is the relations. So, harezo mekudeshet utnao batel devrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says she is betrothed, but he has to pay all those things. The t'nai doesn't take place. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'davar shebamamon t'nao kayan. He can do this. This is financial. If she agrees, no problem. It works. Okay, so I want to just talk about Rabbi Meir for 1 second, and then I'm going to send you to listen to Gefa, which should hopefully be up later today on our site. A very famous Tosfot here. Rabbi Meir is really not our position that we're focusing on, so I don't want to spend time on it. There's a big problem Tosfot has with what Rabbi Meir says. If I would say that tonight doesn't work, what would you assume? If I say, or a man says, you are betrothed to me on the condition that I'm not going to give you all the stuff. If we say it doesn't work, what would it mean? You're not betrothed and because you can't, right? But what does Rabbi Meir say? You are betrothed. The action happens, just the t'nai doesn't. And, it's very strange because in theory, he wasn't betrothing her with the intent to provide her with all those things. So how can we say that the betrothal is valid, even though, right, we get rid of the condition? Like we still keep the first part, we just get rid of the second part. It's a big question of Tosfot. If you look how long Tosfot is, it starts about 2/3 of the way down on this page, and it goes till 2/3 of the way on the next page. It's super long Tosfot. In Gefet, Rabbi Meir Shimoni is going to do part of the Tosfot, not the whole thing. It's a very basic Tosfot about laws of t'naim, conditions, stipulations, all that. Very interesting. So I recommended listening, but not for us right now. So basically, we're stuck with this contradiction with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda seems to say by us, again, it's an inference that in a case where she said it, stipulated orally, the t'nai wouldn't work because it's against Mashka Torah. And here he says, if it's financial thing, Hareza Mekudeshet, but I'm not going to give you all those three things. She actually is betrothed and he doesn't need to provide her with all those things. So the answer is, and we're going to have some issues with this answer, but Kasava Rabbi Yehuda, he holds ketuba de Rabbanan. Ketuba is only rabbinic. Okay, so what? We've seen this before. The rabbis were worried people wouldn't take their rabbinic stuff seriously. So they made the law stricter. When it comes to Torah law, like Kiddushin, you can go against Mashka Torah. Shiur, ketuba, it's fine. If she agrees, no problem. But when it comes to ketuba, no way, no how. Ketuba is rabbinic. They were worried people wouldn't take it seriously. And therefore, they instituted that even Rabbi Yehuda says, you can't go against this. She can't stipulate orally that she's not going to do, that she's giving up on her ketuba. To which the Gemara says, wait, are you saying, and now we're going to limit this, in what rabbinic cases do we say this? Do we say the Chachamim Chizuk? It's not always. Hare peirot Rabbanan, v'lo avdula Rabbanan chizuk ditnan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, okay, peirot, proceeds of her nichse malog. Remember the property she brings in, her use of property she brings into the marriage. He has rights to the proceeds. Okay, la'olam ochel perei peirot. He can even, let's say he makes money and he buys new land with it and makes money off that. All of that he can benefit from during her lifetime. She'll get it all back when he dies, or when the ketuba is invalid. He can always eat them ad shichtovla, unless he writes to her. In other words, he has rights to all the proceeds, which is rabbinic. The rabbis gave him rights to the proceeds. Unless he writes her, dinu dvarim ein li b'nechsayach u'beperotehan ad olam. Unless he writes to her, which in a second they're going to say, and I'm a bet now, v'kaim ala mai kotev omer. When it says write, it really means says, which then would make it parallel to our case. And until he says, basically, I don't want all your proceeds. I'm not interested in them. If he says that, it works. Now, Perot or Durabanan, and we just said, the rabbis don't allow you to make a condition against what the rabbi said. So how did he make a condition against what the rabbi said? So Amar Abaye, la kol yesh ketuba, lo la kol yesh perot. Ketuba is something that everybody has. Not every woman comes in with usufruct property. Not every woman, even if she does, has proceeds from it. So, milta d'shchicha avdu rabbanan chizuk. When it was something very common, we've seen this many times. Things that are common, they dealt with more, right? So then the rabbis wanted to strengthen it. That's why you can't go against the ketuba. But milta de lo shchicha lo avdu rabbanan chizuk. If it's not a very common thing, like the payroll of the nichse malog, are not as common, therefore the rabbis saw no need to strengthen it. Remember, in those days, it wasn't common that women had their own land. To which the rabbis have a further question on this. Wait, you're going to say it all depends how common or uncommon it is? Now we're leaving the world of t'naim, conditions, but we're still in the world of rabbinic. Common, we're going to treat, right, take it more seriously, even more serious than Torah. And less common, we're not. So chamarim, donkey riders, are actually very common. They come to town, they want to sell their wares. And we're going to see the rabbis didn't do chizuk l'divreihem. Okay, they basically, what we're going to see is they treated Torah law more strict than rabbinic law, which is the opposite of what we just said. We just proved ketubas common. The rabbis wanted to make sure that nobody took it not seriously, and therefore it was stricter law than Torah. Here we're going to have the reverse. Ditnan, hachamarim shenichnesu la'ir. We had this on Daf Kaf Daled. When we were talking about gomlim, you remember there's concern that people might be lying to help their friend, like as a helping their friend in order to help them in the end. So that they're each doing tit for tat. Hachamarim shenichnesu la'ir, two donkey riders come into town, nobody knows them. Mine are new, my wheat, my grains, which means one of two things, either new halachically, there's yashan from after the korban ha'omer was given or before, or more likely, Rashi rejects that opinion, and more likely it's mine are moist still, and his are dry, which is better. You want dry grains. Mine, I didn't take Truma Masra from, but he did. Okay, because these were Amei Aretz, they weren't trusted, but he said, my friend did take Truma Mas. It's going to be the important part for our purposes. Ein emani, they're not believed. We're worried they're lying, each one for each other. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ne'emani, we believe them. Okay, we believe them, which means when it comes to eating demai, right? It's demai is we're not sure if it's tithed or not, Amei Aretz stuff. Well, we allow you to eat it. If he says, mine or not, I didn't take Truma Masra, but my friend did, so you can believe him about the friend, okay? Because he's putting himself down, you actually can believe it. We're not worried about gomlim, okay? Now, what do you see here? So, when it comes to rabbinic, because demai is rabbinic, and it's something that's very common, we're going to believe them. If it were Torah law, we would no way believe him. So here you see, we treat Torah law more strict than common rabbinic things. To which Abaye says, Amar Abaye, Vadai de Divreim, again, we're going to make another distinction. So we started with rabbinic, the rabbis all strengthened, and you can believe, right? You can't do it tonight against Mashkatuba in the rabbis, but you can against Mashkatuba Torah. We limited only to common things and not uncommon cases. Now, even within the common, we're going to limit it and say, Vadai de Divreim avdu rabbanan chizuk, safek de Divreim lo avdu rabbanan chizuk. When it came to something vadai, like a ketuba is 200 zuz, so then they made a chizuk. This is just a safek. We're not sure. Did they take Truma Masra or didn't they? There we can be lenient. Rava gives a different answer. Rav Amar b'demai hikilu. Demai in general, we're very lenient because in the end, even though we're suspect of these Amei Aretz, the truth is most Amei Aretz do take Truma Masra. It was just a chumrah that they instituted. So demai is just unique and you can't learn from demai anything else. Okay, so we basically limited this Chachamim asu chizuk l'divrayim, yoter mishal Torah, to not necessarily all kinds of situations. And that was the second question we had of Rabbi Yehuda. We're now moving on to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir Omer, kol apochet. Again, we're going to have an inference, which again, a little bit of a lack of clarity exactly how they're inferring what they're inferring. But the Mishna had said, Rabbi Meir says, kol apochet lebetulami matayim ulam anami maneh. If you give any less than that, harei zo be'ilatznu. So they're going to infer now. Kol apochet afilu bitna'a, even in the condition. Alma kasaval tna'o batel ve'ila. They're inferring right now. So Rashi says, how do they infer this? He says, well, it should have said, any betula you didn't give 200 or an alman 100, it's bilatznu. But they don't say that. They said anyone who diminished it by that, which seems to infer that if he did, he made a stipulation. It's not that, right? It's he gave her 200, but stipulated not the whole thing, right? Somehow she stipulated, I got some of it. The Tanai, the stipulation is batel, ve'ila, but she actually gets the 200 zuz. It's like before. She's mikudeshet, but the whole Tanai falls to the wayside. V'kevan de amarle, leitlach elamana. Now, the question is, if that's the case, why is this a bilat znut? Basically, he promised her, right, 200, but then he got her to agree to only 100. We're going to say that's a bilat znut, even though in the end she gets 200 zuz. So why is it a bilat znut? It doesn't really make so much sense. So they say, well, he says to her, you're really only going to get a maneh. Okay. Lo sam chadata. Now, what's the whole point of a ketuba? The point of a ketuba is that the woman, it's protecting her so that he won't divorce her quickly. Now, why is this called the bilat znut, licentious behavior, that they're not really married? Because she's not confident in the marriage. Lo sam chadata means she doesn't know the halacha that he actually has to give her the whole 200. When it gets to court, the court will say, oh, you have to give her the whole 200. She doesn't know that. She thinks that she's only getting 100, and she thinks, and oh, maybe he'll divorce me easily. So this is fascinating, by the way. Since she's not confident in the relationship, we call this a bilat znut, because she's not comfortable thinking that I'm protected in my marriage. And that's why it's a bilat znut. Now they ask another question of Rabbi Meir. They say, Rabbi Meir, but didn't we learn that Rabbi Meir said, if you're going against something it says in the Torah, your stipulation is batel, which would infer what? This would be the exact opposite of Rabbi Yehuda. Specifically in derabbanans, it would work. You can go against the Torah in derabbanans. You just can't go against Torah law. You can go against rabbinic law. That's an inference from him. So now we have a problem, because isn't ketuba rabbinic? And how does Rabbi Meir say that Tanai is canceled? But Rabbanan, it should be okay. Kasavar Rabbi Meir ketuba de'oraita. And this is what I told you before. In the end, we see it's a machlokah Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yehuda, whether the ketuba is de'oraita or de'rabbanan. So they have two machlokot. One is ketuba de'oraita de'rabbanan, and number two, in which case do we say you can go right? Can you go against mashketuba Torah and not the rabbis, or the reverse? And again, Rabbi Yehuda specifically says he doesn't think you could go against mashketuba Torah, but he does think that that if it's financial, you can. Okay, not in general, but yes, in financial stuff. Tanya, Rabbi Meir Omer. Now we're going to have a braita, which brings a new opinion, which is Rabbi Yosi, and we'll have a question on Rabbi Yosi, how he seems to contradict himself somewhere else, and then we're going to explain the contradiction, and that's for the rest of the daf. Rabbi Meir Omer, half of this is repetitive because we're going to quote Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. We're just going to add Rabbi Yosi in the middle. Rabbi Meir Omer, that's Rabbi Meir, can't give any less. If you do, it's licentious behavior. Rabbi Yosi Omer Rashai, Rabbi Yosi says you can, it's no problem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ratzah kotev lebtula shtar shel 200 v'kotev lo etkabalti mimcha maneh u'lamana maneh v'kotev lo etkabalti mimcha 50 zuz. Okay, that's Rabbi Yehuda. She can write in her ketuba, right? Again, how exactly she writes it, where she writes it, but she can write, I got half, and that works. So now, that was just repetitive, but Sava Rabbi Yosi Rashai, does Rabbi Yosi really think that he can just write her less money? Urimini, that seems to contradict this other source. And finally, we're going to learn, we talked about yesterday, she can't demand her ketuba money from metaltalim. She can't get it from metaltalim. Why? He has to provide her land. You can't give metaltalim because of tikkun olam. What's the assumption? Metaltalim prices change. So if he designates metaltalim and the prices go down, she'll end up losing out. Amar v'yasi, v'chima tikkun olam yesh bezo halo en ktuvinu pochatin. Very unclear line. What kind of tikkun olam is this? They're not set values and they go down. Things depreciate in value. So the Gemara says, Tanakama, Nami eno sin kamar. I understand. He seems to be saying the same thing as the rabbis. Makes no sense. Ela lav hachi kamar. First, we're going to understand it, and then we're going to say this contradicts what Rabbi Yosi said by us. What we're really meant to say is, Bamed dvarim amurim b'shelo kibel alav acharayut, aval kibel alav acharayut osim. You can designate metaltalin according to Tanakama as long as you said, I commit to, right, I'm responsible, meaning if something. Part of the problem with metaltalin is they get lost also. So if you say, this is your ketuba, and then they get lost, she's going to be stuck. So that's right. So if you say, I'll take responsibility. If something happens to them, it's on me. The husband says that, then it's fine. Then when he says, what kind of tikkun olam is there in that? Meaning, That doesn't resolve all issues because halo ein suvinu pochatin. You still have the problem of the items being worth less money over time, and then she's going to end up getting less money than her ketuba worth. So now, what's the question? What does it have to do with our case? Hashtu mahatam de dilma pachte chayish Rabbi Yosi. There, Rabbi Yosi won't let him give her the ketuba like this because maybe they will diminish in value. You don't even know if they're going to diminish in value. Some items go up in value. In our case, where he's clearly diminishing the value of her ketuba, all the more so he shouldn't allow it. He's so careful that she get exactly what she's expected. Of course, he can't lower the value. So how could he have possibly said that you can lower the value? To which the Gemara says, these are two totally different cases. When he promises her metalton, she doesn't know that they're going to go down in value. It's not like she said, okay, I don't mind if they go down in value, I'll take this. She wasn't a party here. He just set aside this for her. Then we have to worry the price might go down. But in our case, she knew and she agreed to it. She agrees to it, then yes, you can give her less. So according to Rabbi Yosi, as long as she agrees, it's fine. According to, when it comes to the other case, you can't give her metaltalin because they might go down in value. We don't want to have her lose out in a case where she didn't agree to lose out. So it's not even a question, and therefore we end our daf, as I promised, in a place where everything is resolved. We now understood we had three opinions, Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yehuda, and we had questions on all three opinions, and we resolved all the questions that we had. That's it for today. Have a great day, everyone.